Good evening. I'm Professor Elizabeth Prodromou at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I'm the Faculty Director of the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone here this evening to the second in a four-panel series that the Initiative is hosting this semester, led by the Religion, Law, and Diplomacy Club at the Fletcher School on the topic of religion and peace building. Tonight's panel deals specifically with the topic of liberation theology and peace building, and we have two fascinating and compelling speakers, Dr. Sheikh Ibrahim Kazerouni and Dr. Juan Floyd Thomas. Christopher Pumford, who is a leader of the student club, will be introducing them momentarily. I want to thank all of you for joining us. The Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy at the Fletcher School is committed to religious literacy, to promoting religious literacy in the study and practice of international relations. And so it's a pleasure to be hosting this four-part series. I would call your attention as well to two more upcoming panels in this series, one on religion, women, and peace building on March 11th from 5:30 to 7 p.m., and the final one on religion and community, growing resilience through interfaith peace building. And that will be on April 1st from 5:30 to 7 p.m. You can find the full schedule of all of our panels and also other events and research projects of the initiative on the webpage of the Fletcher Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. But now, with no further ado, I turn this over to Christopher Pumford, and he will be introducing our speakers for this evening. Chris?
Thank you, Professor. And we'd like to thank everybody for their patience today with the Zoom. Unfortunately, we're having some technical difficulties having Sheikh Kazerouni join us. But in the meanwhile, we're delighted to have Professor Floyd Thomas with us this evening. Professor Floyd Thomas is Associate Professor of African American Religious History at Vanderbilt University Divinity School and core faculty of Historical Studies area in the Graduate Department of Religion. In addition to having written numerous journal articles and book chapters, Dr. Floyd Thomas is author of The Origins of Black Humanism, Reverend Ethelred Brown and the Unitarian Church, and Liberating Black Church History, Making It Plain. Moreover, he is both a co-founder and an executive board member of the Black Religious Scholars Group and presently serves as the executive director of the Society of Race, Ethnicity, and Religion. While we await for Sheikh Kazerouni, I will introduce him. And after his introduction, we will launch right into Dr. Floyd Thomas's remarks. So in regards to Sheikh Kazerouni, he is currently Imam at the Islamic Center of America in Dearborn, Michigan, and adjunct faculty at the University of Detroit Mercy. He has served on numerous boards and received a number of awards for his bridge building and peace initiatives. He is also a fellow at the Center for the Study of Human Trafficking at the Corbell School of International Studies. Tonight, we're going to discuss the concept of liberation theology in terms of the Shiite, Islamic, and Black church traditions in America. Here, we'll discuss key features such as traditions that relate to issues of poverty, equity, voice, and human freedom, whether understood or in spiritual ontological terms, or in terms of human and community agency. Of course, we'll be leveraging the experience of our two esteemed guests, and it'll be up to them to talk about what do they feel most impressed upon at this time. Afterwards, after the remarks, we'll launch into a discussion. So please include your questions in the discussion forum, and we'll take those and ask them at the second part of the session. So without further ado, I turn the time over to Dr. Floyd Thomas.
Dr. Floyd Thomas, as you begin, I want to follow briefly on something that Chris noted, which is the diversity of perspectives on liberation theology. And some may think about liberation theology as a passé term, but that originated in the 1960s and seems to have disappeared. But as Chris beautifully laid out, there are so many contemporary circumstances and expressions of liberation theology and the connection with human freedom that we really look forward to hearing from you and Imam Kazerouni on contemporary expressions. and the diversity of those here in the US and around the world. Oh, and fantastic. Imam Kazaruni,
Hi,
welcome.
Elizabeth.
Welcome.
And good
welcome.
afternoon, Dr. Floyd.
All right. So Imam,
Assalamu alaikum.
we'll begin with Dr. Floyd Thomas, and then Sheikh Kazaruni will go to you.
I'm here anyway.
And I thank you. I thank you for the wonderful introduction. I thank you, Dr. Pradramu, for your presence here as the moderator. I thank you to the students, the RLD students, and to my fellow panelists, Sheikh Kazaruni. I thank you for your presence here as well. For the time that I have, I'm hoping on the heels of what Dr. Pradramu was discussing and describing, I'm hoping to give some remarks in terms of what I see as the development, the evolution from Black liberation theology to Black Lives Matters, and hopefully by the end of my comments to situate them in somewhat of a global context and perspective. To begin, I share a story very briefly with you all. In the early 2010s, roughly 2011 or 2012, thereabouts, I was invited by the admissions office at our institution, Vanderbilt Divinity School, to come and sit on a panel of faculty members to discuss and describe for prospective students many of the features of our admissions program. Many of our curricular developments and talk from our field of expertise and specialization. So I'm there in my capacity as a historian of religion, specifically to talk about what we call the Black Church Studies program. During the Q&A of that event, a young Black male prospective student raises his hand and asks a question, and I'm speaking verbatim here. Do you all teach that liberation theology? And so in receiving that question, the first thing that popped into my head and immediately rolled off my tongue was, yes, what do you expect us to teach? A theology of slavery and colonization. Now, I don't offer that as any kind of example of my sparkling wit or witty repartee, but rather it exposed to me both then and now some of what you were talking about, Dr. Pradramu, which is this concern about, was liberation theology merely a relic of the past? Was it simply a product and creature of its time, the late 1960s? I think about in the recent passing of the late, great James Cone, who was a visionary theologian who crafted and cultivated Black liberation theology with his first work in 1969, Black Theology and Black Power, where, among his many contributions to religious thought and theological education was him saying the loud part or the quiet part out loud, so to speak, wherein intentionally rather than incidentally looking at the pluralistic and the diverse sources of not just African-American religion, but religion writ large, right? When he combines and tries to bring into conversation, right, the observations and the insights of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a kind of paragon of African-American Christianity, but also infused with Gandhiism. And then you also situate him alongside Malcolm X as this kind of exemplar of a Black Muslim identity, also infused with various elements of American religion writ large, right? His own kind of roots in Black Baptist and evangelical traditions, right? What we see with the origins of Black liberation theology is such that it was speaking to a historical moment, but then not only was it timely, but I'm arguing, and I still assert that it is quite timeless, because if we focus on that pivotal term in the phrase liberation, right? I can't claim to argue that we as a people, as a culture, as a society, or as a globe have witnessed full liberation, right? to that point, you know, when we take issue with, okay, what does it mean to strive toward or achieve liberation? For many of us, myself included, the argument becomes, how do you firmly establish and equate human existence with key issues of what every society, I hope, aspires to, namely freedom, justice, equality, and the furtherance of human dignity, right? If you can have those four elements, right, for all the kind of huffing and puffing about these liberal democratic principles and norms that modern, quote, and I'm putting that in very large scare quotes, modern societies are supposed to strive towards, right? Those four elements ought to be crucial for every human being, right? And Black liberation theology at its best, when it's working in a not just an optimistic but an optimal fashion, is trying to achieve those things. When I think about my first work, and thankfully Christopher made mention of my first book, The Origins of Black Humanism. I was talking about in that work a small church in Harlem, you know, a Unitarian church where the majority of the congregation, including the pastor, were Afro-Caribbean immigrants who, in the middle of the early 20th century, starting in the 1920s, with the swirl of energy and activity around Harlem, they were also, you know, communists and socialists. They were also working class intellectuals, right? They were also, some of them were members of the Garvey Pan-African movement, right? Some of them were affiliated and attached to the Harlem Renaissance intelligentsia and artists and things of that sort. And so it was a golden opportunity for, you know, a young scholar, as I was then, to try and delve into these concerns about the intersections of faith and politics and culture, especially in ways that upended traditional religious narratives, or look beyond ideological and class-based sectarian politics, and also extended conversations beyond boundaries of racial, ethnic, or national identities. But as time progressed, and especially around the time that coincided with that anecdote that I shared about the encounter with the prospective student, I had begun a project which I'm now proud to say I've saw actually a kind of full circle effect, where roughly at that time I was writing about then President Obama and trying to situate his foreign policy within the framework of just war theory, and move both then and now with, at the time he had just been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. We're also now, even as we sit here in this event, we're now witnessing the 10th anniversary of what we once called the Arab Spring. I was trying to process a lot of energy in terms of what it meant for someone like President Obama, who himself, as a Christian, as a churchgoer, had been exposed directly through the preaching and teaching of Jeremiah Wright, the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright. He had been a direct recipient, a beneficiary, if you will, of Black liberation theology. And I wanted to try to test whether those principles, those ideals were factoring into both Obama's domestic and, more germane to our conversation, his foreign policy. I had since, in a recent volume that I co-edited, Religion in the Age of Obama, I was able to close the circle on that conversation by offering up a kind of 8-year retrospective on Obama's foreign policy and how it was in some ways hitting the mark, in some ways missing the mark, in terms of, did it ever live up to the full promise of his anti-war posture early on in his career, first as senator and then ultimately as president, right? What did it mean to have the first Black president, the first American president of African descent, also continuing and extending the global war on terror? And, I leave it to readers to engage with the work and hopefully see any insights. And I'm glad to, if Q&A allows time, to delve deeper into that. But I'm also, to wrap up my comments in short order, grappling with and wrestling with what does it mean for Black Lives Matters as a movement, first starting here in America, but now becoming globalized to take its full shape and view, especially as a civil rights agenda, a human rights agenda that thankfully, due to the three founders of the movement, right, three Black women, right, operated largely independent of, or in fact, free from the institutional Black church tradition that we're familiarize ourselves with, which had typically been the incubator, the source from which many of our previous social justice movements had emerged. Also attached to that, and I think I can conclude with this comment, how the movement for Black lives as it is emerged and evolved has begun to, I think, more responsibly and more respectfully delve into issues of intersectionality, right? More clearly and more forcefully talking about a class-based analysis or a gender and sexual analysis of structural oppression and injustice, right? The idea that we were wrestling with, especially as I'll note in two instances here in the United States, with the outgrowth of protests and responses in the wake of the murders of individuals such as Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the fact that even in the midst of a pandemic, I think the fulsome response that we saw from a vast majority of society was crucial to talking about the fact that the quest for liberation, the quest for freedom, justice, equality, and dignity is not dead, it's not dormant, it's not a fossil or a relic. But now we have to not only elevate the debate, but also expand our range of options, the conditions of our possibility, right? To build bridges rather than barriers to the other communities that are subjugated in our society, right? And not simply or solely depend on issues of grievance politics or issues of extending protests as simply an outgrowth of frustration, but now actually building it as a political framework. The last thing I'll say on this note is also with the globalization of Black Lives Matters, we have to wrestle with what happens in Brazilian favelas. We have to wrestle with what happens in the banlieues of Paris, right? We have to wrestle with, for instance, a few months ago, I believe, in Nigeria, there was a whole operation by the Nigerian government with a police unit known as SARS, right? And that, to me, as an outsider looking in, very much resembled the kind of corruption and systemic abuses that we witness here in America in terms of, institutionalized or internalized racism and systemic bias. But here it was in a majority Black country against its own populace, its own citizenry, right? We need to and we have to call out those levels of injustice just as rapidly as we would call them out in the UK or in France or in the United States and other nation states. So to close, the challenges of Black liberation theology are many, right? In terms of how not only it can tap into its own history, right? Its own roots of not incidentally, but intentionally being interreligious, to be intentionally active and politically minded, to be actively and maybe even aggressively focused on concrete solutions to political and social and cultural and even spiritual problems, rather than retreat to the abstract. And then last but not least, the idea that, borrowing from Dr. King, right, peace, if we're talking about peace building, peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the presence or abundance of justice. So what we're always mindful of is how to increase, especially in this moment now where we're trying to wrestle with a post-Trump era and whatever that is going to mean for not just individuals or institutions, but nations, right? What is it going to be, this future that we're going to try to create and cultivate? And so with that, I close.
Thank you very much for your comments. Those are it raises lots of questions that we'll be happy to get into in a moment. We'd like to again welcome Sheikh Kazerouni to this conversation today, from one Michigander to another. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Christopher.
We gave you an introduction earlier, so you're free to begin your remarks.
Well, I would appreciate it if the earlier questions that were posed, that I have missed them, if you could repeat them so I become familiar with them, because for a while I was grappling with the technology trying to get through. So I'll wait to see what was said, because I missed all of those.
Certainly. I can provide some introductory things to consider. Then, of course, the professor will have some points that she's particularly interested in. For the context of the conversation in general, we're talking about how you understand the concept of liberation theology in terms of the Shiite Islamic traditions in America. So going back to your personal experience with that, and then what are the key features of these traditions as they relate to issues of poverty, equity, voice, human freedom, whether understood in a spiritual or in terms of human and community agency, capacity to choose. Professor Prodromou, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think when we began, and this is something we spoke about, I think, in the preparation for tonight's webinar, one of the things that is interesting is that liberation theology, although it's a term that's associated with a particular time period, a particular geographic space, and even a particular confession, it has resonance today. And I think Dr. Floyd Thomas's remarks already underscored the fact that there is a timelessness and a universality to the content of liberation theology. But there's also a specificity and a particularity to that. And so it would be wonderful to hear from you, Sheikh, about what that term, what actually means from a Shia perspective, and perhaps from a Shia perspective in the space of a highly religiously plural and religiously competitive United States, but certainly not limited to either this location or this time.
Well, thank you very much for to enlighten me or explain the circumstance. I would like to begin, first of all, by thanking the organizers for the invite, and particularly you, Professor, and the other panel members or the team members for organizing the panel. And it is an honor to meet my co-panelist, Dr. Floyd. Within this 15 minutes time, I'll try to remain as faithful to the 15 minutes as possible. I'll try, my aim is primarily to sketch the train of Muslim liberation theology, and then transition from there into peace building, if time allows it. But before I say anything, I think there are a few issues that we really need to discuss as a preamble to the discussion, so that the answer to the last question, or to one of the questions, whether concerned liberation theology is passé and it's something about the past and it's irrelevant to today, would be clear once we deconstruct the whole thing, the whole concept of liberation theology, and from there We see how it's relevant, as Dr. Floyd had already, when we look at some of the components, some narratives might be of the past, or the context might be of the past, but certainly there are a number of factors that are relevant to the future and to present. I believe when we look, I read liberation theology at the time when I was at Iliff School of Theology, doing my master's in Jewish and Christian history. And we had huge debate with the professors at the time regarding the whole issue of liberation theology. Particularly, they were looking at it from Christian perspective. I was trying to deconstruct this into what I call fundamental elements that has nothing to do with Christianity, but it is a universal issue, and whether Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or any other people can make a contribution and connection and resonate with it. I believe Father Gauthier has left us with a number of concrete questions. Number one, within the gist of his writing, is sacred literature relevant to the contemporary global concern of social injustice, poverty, unemployment, marginalization, and violence? And by saying sacred literature, I choose my words deliberately so that it opens the space as a question, all of us, whether we are within, say, as a Muslim theologian, or specifically as a Shia theologian, or Christian theologian, or Jewish theologian, do we consider our sacred literature to be able to be relevant to the time in the light of the toxicity of the crisis that we live in? That's number one. And what should be the response of the theologians to the marginalization of the vast segment of human race condemned to live in perpetual poverty, degradation, which was the dominant theme in the liberation theology, as well as the Medellin Conference of 1968. And I'm glad that Dr. Floyd brought this concept down to the African-American Black theology. We can talk about the Palestinian issue in this within this context. We can other poor sections that are in various countries around the world. Father Gauthier argued that liberation, this is one of the critical issues that, incidentally, again, I was reading Dr. Floyd's book regarding liberating Black churches. Liberation, he kept hammering in on this note, argued that the liberation from personal prison of sin is incomplete without further liberation from unjust human structure of power. He stated that to effect a distinction between political and religious is already a political act. So in response to the church at that time, John Paul II, and particularly the chief of staff that later on became the Pope, Father Ratzinger, Gauthier is trying to get the church to engage in politics. He repeatedly said, by separating yourself from the crisis and somehow focusing on the private salvation issue is a political act. And it echoes with the book that I read many years ago from Howard Zinn that says you can't be neutral on a moving train. But if we were once we deal with, and these questions clearly are relevant today. As theologians, as Muslim theologian, I have to think about these issues and respond to them as much as all other Christian theologians in whatever school of thought or Jewish or other people have to reflect upon. But with this as a backdrop, liberation theology has got a number of features that I think we really need to deconstruct in preparation to my answer at the end, which is going to state that whether it is relevant or not. Number one, it is rooted in ordinary people's everyday experience of poverty, race, marginalization. That was the context under which he developed the idea. Although the book was written in 1973, or at least published in 1973, we could detect his ideas, the Medellin Conference of Colombia in 1968. But at the same time, there were a number of other fields of studies, such as subaltern studies, post-colonial studies, and a number of other studies that focused on this marginalization, focused on rereading of the structure of the scripture, reading and reinterpreting it, and so that the scripture is brought down and made relevant to everyday experience of the people that have to call themselves faithful to that scripture. As Carlos Mester stated, liberation theology is not in a new theology. It's a new way of doing theology, which is focuses on praxis more than the scripture and interpretation, a unique interpretation. It is a theology which in many parts of the world has deep roots because of unjust world order that we live in. I remember during the time that I was at ILIF, we had South Korean liberation theology, we had Chinese liberation theology, we had African liberation theology, we had Muslim liberation theology, etc., etc. So all of these theologians focused on this component or this part feature of it, that because it calls upon, well, in the original context was calling upon the church or Christians to be mindful and conscious of this marginalization and poverty and everything else, race, experience, and so on. But I believe this is something that all of us, all theologians, have to or resonate with, and something that we have to work upon. Because of that, because it focuses on a unique interpretation of scripture, it calls upon all of us. If we really want to respond to the crisis, we really need to step back and look at our own scripture and think about how orthodoxy has been constructed and at what a price, particularly the part of the scripture that has been ignored or conveniently overlooked, that led to the separation of the scripture or a particular faith from the reality of life outside. So we have to go back, as a Shia scholar, I have to go back to the text and to the scripture and say, okay, if there is a call, and I have a responsibility. I was among the first people that I began a course since Dr. Floyd talked about the Arab Spring. At that time, I was teaching at the Corbel School of International Studies. I was among the first, I believe the first professor or assistant professor that I started teaching, or adjunct professor that I started teaching a course on Arab Spring. And particularly the dynamic relationship between the scripture and the Arab Spring, which is what we call it, the Quran and the Arab Spring. So this is another issue that we have. And it is not, what makes this kind of theology so unique, it is not explored in purely tutorial and seminars. It calls in the people to develop this theology or unpack it in the midst of life struggle and deprivation, which makes it a bottom-up approach theology rather than the top-down that somehow handed to the marginalized by ecclesiastical or theological experts. These this is how I see liberation theology, or when I deconstruct liberation theology, Father Gautier's book, or many others, I see these issues to be of critical importance. Now, when we go back, I have to quickly wrap up. When we go back to, say, Islamic approach to it, Shia theologians reject Islam being reduced to an item of piety in the private sector. Such a faith counters the original understanding of faith in the way it was brought by its founder, Prophet Muhammad. The central, we believe, and I have constantly talked about this, the central aim of the Quran is to establish a viable social order on earth that will be just and ethically based. This goal was announced right from the beginning through a severe denunciation of all the factors that led to disequilibrium within the social structure. And they were considered to be symptomatic of segmentation of society. Society, anything that divides society into have and have-nots have to be rejected. Dr. Floyd talked about freedom and justice, equality, dignity. That's exactly what we see in our literature, that this is a universal issue. It has nothing to do with a particular faith. All human beings deserve to have freedom. All human beings deserve to live in a just society with equality and dignity. Unfortunately, what the concept of Tawheed that we talked about as the fundamental basis for Islam, the belief in one God, the essential unity, it somehow relates the concept of belief in one God as no divinity but the supreme divinity. And at the same time, it relates it to integration of that unity within the creation, which is what we call within the life and people and society and communities together. Simple belief in the unity of God, that without working for conformity and unity and social integration of society, that unity is not complete. This is why when we go back to the early history of Islam, particularly with the Medina Protocol, when the Prophet Muhammad goes to Medina, the first step is to bring this convergence of Jews, Christians, Arabs, and everybody else under one umbrella that are working for the establishment of justice for the benefit of all. This leaves me with a slight disagreement with due respect with Martin Luther King and even Father Gautier, that purely focused on peaceful approach to creating peace, or at least resolving the conflict. In Islam, I think I can even look to some concept of Christianity. The peace, justice through prayers only will not be achieved. We really need to be more practice-orientated. Jeremiah 8:15, I believe, says that no good will come out of such but more injustice if we really don't work hard. But our literature clearly encourage us that the concept of justice, that is the ultimate goal for humans and the ultimate goal of all prophets that have been commanded by God to guide humanity, that justice cannot be achieved by one community only. It has to be a collaborative effort by everyone working together. And I believe this is in 2005, Ayatollah Sistani, his office, sent a declaration, and which I read, and by that I end. It says, today humanity is in dire need of diligent efforts by its leaders, especially those in position to import religious and spiritual guidance, to promote the values of love and peaceful coexistence based on preserving the rights of all people and observing mutual respect among the followers of different religious and schools of thought. I think this will be a place where I will stop because I don't want to go over, and we will see what comes out of the question and answer session. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you for two extraordinarily rich presentations. I think in terms of moving forward, Chris and I would each like to pose a question, but we want to encourage everyone to post questions in the Q&A, and we will ask questions of our speakers. And I already see one, so I encourage people to submit more questions. But I'll use then the prerogative of the co-moderator here with Chris, and I want to ask a couple of interrelated questions. Both of you, Sheikh Kazruni and Dr. Floyd Thomas, both of you, I think, agreed that there is a kind of universality to the phrase liberation theology and even to the foundational concepts and message of the right to and fight for human dignity, justice and equality, and also social justice as well. I wonder, but then you each took it in different directions based on your areas of expertise. One thing I would like to ask you is how it is that in the context of multi-faith conversations, you draw on your own traditions, resources in ways that are understandable across faith boundaries. Is there a particular method that you use? Are you aware of that as both an enabler but also a potential impediment to the kind of multi-faith broad social cooperation that Imam Kazruni discussed? And I have something even concrete here to give as an example. I was reading something that Lincoln had written, and more recent, expressions under the current Black Lives Matter movement, and there's a reference to the original sin of slavery. And that's a concept I think that resonates with, we understand what that means in kind of colloquial terms, and yet the notion of original sin is very much rooted in one particular set of traditions, confessions, that is Western Christianity. That's not a concept in Eastern Christianity. I don't think it's a concept in Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism, and yet it's a term that resonates broadly. Do you see those kinds of that kind of language as helping to build the kinds of coalitions that you both were discussed, or are you also aware of the fact that because they may be alien to some traditions, they constitute an impediment? I guess what I'm asking in simple terms is, how do you mine your own resources, and how do you give attention to the language that's associated with your own traditions in order to build the kind of broad coalitions supporting social justice and human dignity that you both described?
I can go if my colleague.
Dr. Floyd.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So much. Thank you, Sheikh. To begin, and here I actually invoke a late mentor and guide for myself, who was a historian and activist, and I'm not sure about the Sheikh's time at ILIF, but he was also a faculty member there. I'm talking about Dr. Vincent Harding.
Oh yes, he was my teacher. He was my professor.
I see you bear his imprint. I'm grateful and glad for that.
Thank you.
He wrote an essay many years ago called "The Vocation of the Black Scholar and the Struggles of the Black Community." And in that essay, among many things that he contributes to our conversation, he talks about the fact that our essential social, political, spiritual context is the colonized situation of the masses of the Black community in America. He would then go on later in that same text to talk about, for it is only within the context of the long fight for freedom of the Black community that we are ultimately moved towards a true sense of ourselves. what I tend to do, I read that text in its time and in the circumstances in which he formulated that argument, but I try to update and expand it. Also, let me just put this out for the sake of full disclosure. I'm a first-generation American. My parents were Jamaican immigrants in the wave of the post 1965 opening of America's borders and boundaries. So I come to many of these debates with that sensibility of a both worlds kind of scenario, here and there, rather than us versus them. To say all that, when we think about context, right? Context, identity, I believe that's another element that's crucial to what Dr. Harding is writing about, and then ultimately vocation. These are the kind of trifecta that I try to wrestle with our students, both those who are geared towards ministry, those who are geared towards the academy, and then those who are more attuned to activism or just trying to be good and decent citizens in the world, right? In this way, Vanderbilt is very simpatico, very similar to Iliff in its makeup, in terms of a prophetic and progressive kind of theology and politics. But to that point, whereas in Christianity, we endorse and hopefully encourage, at its best, right, a notion of koinonia, right? What Dr. King would have framed as a beloved community, or the mutuality and fellowship of all humanity. But then also that being driven by, and I'm sorry for throwing these theological terms out, but I think they get the job done. The notion of metanoia, right? A notion of awakening and consciousness towards not only the divine, but this linkage that we're talking about here, this linkage of divine justice and social justice, right? What I find in some regards, I find a complementarity with Islam, when in our culture, talking about the United States, we have mangled and misinterpreted the notion of jihad, but the notion that, you have the jihad that is external, that is outward looking, about transforming and changing society, but then it also has to be met with the internal jihad. And I would appreciate any correction if I'm wrong in my understanding by the—
You're doing fine, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Right. So this notion of the internal jihad, the transformation that has to be engaged within, right? It's not talking about throwing bricks or bombs. It's not talking about doing unfair and unjust violence to others. It's talking about, how do I transform the world, but ultimately myself, right? That there has to be a both and rather than an either or, right? When we can draw those kind of connections and those kind of linkages, right? A lot of the bullying, a lot of the blindness that has pervaded so much of our public square and our discourse around religion and culture, around church and state. And I mean that quite literally, that expression, church and state, because of the way it excludes and ignores the multitude and the multiplicity of faith, traditions, and communities in the nation. The last thing I'll say is, once again, to not wrestle with a kind of antiquated or alienating notion of, okay, what does it mean to pursue Black liberation theology or just liberation theology broadly construed, and render it in a more universal term. I draw our attention very quickly to the case of George Floyd. In an upcoming volume by NYU Press, it's called Religion, Race, and COVID-19, Dealing with White Supremacy in the Pandemic. I offer up, through no kind of clairvoyance on my part, but I offer up an essay that talks about Texas as a failed state, basically. In fact, I was delivering a talk about Texas in terms of how its current political makeup exhibits neoliberalism, nihilism, and ultimately necropolitics. I was delivering this the weekend of the big snowstorm. So, you know, God has a way of ordaining things in ways you can't predict. Anyway, I say all that to say, within my comments that day, as well as in my published remarks, I was talking about the situation of George Floyd and the fact that, you know, he spent much of his life in Texas, but then goes to Minneapolis to try to have a fresh start, right? To find a new future in the Twin Cities. That deadly encounter that, you know, ultimately snuffed out his life happens when he walks into, I think it's called Cup stores. And in that establishment, he's accused of passing a counterfeit $20 bill. The owner and proprietor of the store was a Muslim brother, right? Then when the police arrive, 2 of the 4 police officers who were culpable and responsible for Mr. Floyd's death are visibly men of color, right? To my understanding and recognition. Now, in the ongoing investigation and pursuit of what we would dare call justice in his case, right? The Attorney General, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, is an African-American Muslim. Now, I say all that to say that the kind of framework and focus that more traditionally would be fueled by either an older style of Black liberation theology or a more watered down and simplistic notion of Black Lives Matters would simply say that, okay, a Black life was snuffed out by a white power structure. But to this point about the colonized that Dr. Harding raises, right? We have to wrestle with what happens when the agents of death and destruction could in fact be people who have more similarity and sympathy to us than, you know, the dominant culture or you know, that it might not just be white supremacists in form, but now we have to deal with the functionality of white supremacy, right? In its exercise. And the last thing I would say is the kind of complexity of this situation is that if just through, you know, happenstance, if Attorney General Ellison and the proprietor, the owner of Cup stores, Cup food stores, happen to be at the same mosque or masjid, and they're both seeking to, you know, they're both praying for dua, right? Can Allah recognize and acknowledge both of their prayers, right? Can both of their prayers be met in this circumstance, right? And I stop there, you know, and I invite my colleague to share any thoughts about what I've said or anything else.
Well, I would thank you, Dr. Floyd. I would like to start by just adding to the comment that you just raised. I believe in your book, you talk about the South and the North and how each of the 2 communities invoked God and that God is in our side. And I have heard that before. Unfortunately, this is one of the common crises of humanity after 9/11. Among the most, how can I put it, vocal advocate for rounding up all Muslims in Colorado at that time, they were African-American individuals that had some radio shows that they were insisting that Muslims should be either rounded up and put in some kind of separate places, or at least tagged on their ankles so they can be traced. And this is the concept of failure of human being. But going back to Elizabeth's question earlier, if the original sin, as you correctly indicated, is not something that Muslims believe in as part of their Christology and understanding Jesus. So the original sin doesn't exist. However, irrespective of the theological kind of differences that being rejected, if original sin is somehow extended or interpreted in a way that leads to segmentation of society and paralysis and accepting a huge segment of have-not, and with the small segment of have, with no dignity, no justice, and no equality or freedom, we certainly reject it. When you ask how this liberation theology or the multi-faith conversation, in every meeting that I have had or participated, I have tried to present and remind my other group members from different faiths that we cannot sit in somehow our location, whether it's the church or the mosque or the temple or anywhere else or synagogue, and simply talk about peace. We really need to work together for peace. We can identify the crisis that our society is dealing with, and we as not only religious scholars, as ordinary people, we need to work together for dealing with the crisis of injustice and everything else within our society. Before the election started, I had a number of lectures for our communities, just not only before Friday prayer or during the Friday prayer sermon, but also lectures on American politics, in which I implored and encouraged our society members to connect with other members within the society, whether it is the group Black Lives Matters or other social activists, that this is not about Muslims or Arabs or African Americans. It's a social justice issue that we, all of us, have a responsibility to work hard and to make a contribution. We cannot expect the African American community to stand up to the race issue while we are, as we stay back, and then we complain, why is it that nobody else is standing up when Islamophobia is being presented? It's part and parcel of the whole spectrum of that when we talk about indignity and injustice and lack of freedom and equality. We really need to work together. So that is something that I have talked not only in the interfaith and intrafaith, but also in my dealing with trying to establish a relationship with African American community, with other communities around, that these issues will not go away unless we will work together. Now, if original sin is somehow leads into a clear understanding that the world is politically fallen and cannot be redeemed, we disagree with it completely. From our point of view, Islam advances that the world can be fallen due to human failure, but it can be redeemed also partly via political work if we stand up when we understand our responsibility correctly. As I indicated just before I finish my 15 minutes, the verse in the Holy Quran that talks about justice being the ultimate goal of all prophecies asks and implores upholds this, that equity and justice will not be established in the world unless we are all working together. We may differ as far as the narrative that we use, whether it is or the scripture that we use to support our action, but the fact remains the same. Injustice, as we go back to Martin Luther King, injustice somewhere is injustice everywhere. This is where I remember we had a long debate with Professor Harding at Aleph regarding various issues and the time that he had with Martin Luther King. But this is a critical issue. We, as irrespective of our race, gender, political inclination, religious affinity, as basic human beings, it is our responsibility to unite and create that unity that becomes the power that we will be able to change the basis of injustice and poverty and everything else that Father Gutierrez was talking about when he wrote the book and when he presented his opinion in the Medallion Conference.
Thank you very much. These are very insightful questions, and they're starting to dive a little bit more into the application of liberation theology. And coming from my perspective of complete ignorance on the subject, this has been an excellent introduction so far. I'm going to table my question because we want to turn to questions from the audience. So this first question is from Mustafa, and he says, appreciating the potential role of religions for reconciliation and dialogue. Unfortunately, all religions also have legacies that created certain injustices across several societies. How should contemporary religious scholars and practitioners address it? Don't they have responsibilities? And I would appeal, as you're giving your response to this question, appeal to anecdotal data. Any experiences you've seen personally that we can connect with, that would be wonderful.
Go ahead, Dr. Floyd.
Thank you so much. Well, I would think, first and foremost, the ways in which we overcome, right? I don't think, as the Sheikh has alluded to, my book, Liberating Black Church History, one of the key arguments I make early on in that text is that, particularly in America, we have much more of a desire, almost a hunger, if you will, to escape history rather than to embrace it, right? Because even as a relatively young nation in the world, right, so much of our history has been steeped in, uncomfortable, unpleasant, downright inhumane elements. So rather than wrestle and deal with that, right, we try to keep it at arm's length. We try to throw a blanket over it and hope that other people don't notice the mess under the cover. Part of what the responsible person, community, ultimately nation must do is reckon with its history. It's, and also try to learn lessons from its legacy. So I can talk about it even in recent weeks, months, and years. Anecdotally, I've worked at public institutions and private institutions. I've worked, obviously, for the better part of the last 12 or so years at the Divinity School here at Vanderbilt. And as a historian, especially a historian of African and African-American history, right, the issue of slavery just comes up. Or the issue of Jim and Jane Crow racial segregation must emerge. And so there is a way in which people would want to look away from these difficult and demanding topics. Once again, to invoke Dr. Harding, he would talk to me on occasion about how do we teach the hard things? How do we discuss and delve into the hard things, right? And prompted by that exchange with him, I did a research effort where I worked on and compared during the 1930s, right, the emergence of Nazi Germany and its under Hitler, of course, right, and its escalation of its white supremacist project, but looked at it in tandem with the United States during the same era, and then watching both the political, as far as hard power, but then also in terms of soft power, grappling with like cultural tropes and themes that emerged in both societies. And then I had to bring this to my students and have them grapple with this. And this is even a good five to 6 years before anything related to Trumpism or MAGA voters and all that came about. But having to wrestle with in real time, folks wanting to run as if their feet were on fire, right? They wanted to do anything but have this conversation. And yet this is a conversation, I look back at it now and thinking I might have been too tame in the way I was tackling the issue, right? But the idea of how do you compel a conversation that is necessary, not only for the benefit of remembering those who suffered and died under these kind of horrible regimes, but also that you prevent the possibility of them reemerging or being reinvigorated. I'll stop there.
Well, I would like to concur with Dr. Floyd. Number one, there is no denial, there is no faith, there is no culture. Even the secular culture has its own skeleton in the closet. One could brush it under the carpet and write a history in which whitewashes the whole thing and says it didn't happen. I think to be realistic for all the theologians that intend to work in the field of human experience, to understand that these things have happened in the past, and there is no denial, there is no apologetic approach to talking about this. But confronting the bigotry, understanding how religion can be hijacked by a particular group of people, when we have whether it is in Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, or any other faith, religion is hijacked by a particular group of people to justify some political maneuvering or anything else. We don't have the magic wand to turn the whole thing around. But what we can do is, as I indicated, focus in our interpretation of the faith and making it applicable to the daily experience. Focus on call it, as Ayatollah Sistani says, call it on the peace-building element, or on the part of the scripture that had been conveniently ignored, to construct some kind of orthodoxy that creates the either-or, friend and enemy kind of a style. And this is not, it is difficult, it is challenging, but it is not impossible. But I would start with clearly addressing, in all of my lectures, I've talked about the past and the violence that Muslim leadership or kings or whatever they have dashed to the rest of the world. We have to be conscious of that. But what I'm going to do within my capacity is to go back to the scripture, point out that their approach was wrong, because this is not the Islam that claims universality as a religion of peace and unity between all people. This is where I start. And then naturally, I add the context to it as it comes up.
Thank you to both of you. I think both of you have been addressing the issue of internal contradictions, both the positive and the negative record of religion and faith communities when it comes to peace building, but also to deploying in terms of practical theology, the concept of liberation theology. And we have a second question here that also asks you to address, in some ways, these tensions and contradictions. Tatiana asks both of you, when you speak about justice, equality, and liberation, do you speak to the public or private spheres? And what do you mean by public and private? And she goes on to say that, having worked for decades in the UN system, in the Global Forum of Spiritual and Parliamentary Leaders, in the Thanksgiving Foundation, she says, I've seen people speak and behave one way in the public sphere and another in the private sphere. So this issue of public-private, you both touched on it. And in particular, when it comes to ideas of personal liberation and transfiguration, and also the social transformation that you've both discussed in terms of solidarity. How do you make sense of the public-private tensions and inconsistencies?
If you want, Dr. Floyd, I can go this time. I believe in my earlier kind of outlining of what I understood from Father Gutierrez and the whole liberation theology from an Islamic point of view, this notion public-private is rejected. They are all interconnected. There is no justice, as Dr. Floyd aptly described. From an Islamic point of view, the struggle for outside must be supported with struggle from the inside. I cannot become the ambassador of peace if internally there is no balance and equilibrium within my heart and my mind vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So they are somehow interconnected. And the idea that some make a distinction, equality, justice outside, but inside. And this is one of, again, Elizabeth, you mentioned in the earlier email how this relates. I have repeatedly talked about this, criticizing the people within our community, that you present a face outside as extremely pious, etc., etc. But when you go inside, your relationship to your family, your relationship to your children, your relationship to yourself, and your relationship to God and everything else, it does not reflect that image, the exterior image. So from at least my point of view, public-private is rejected. Transformation of society, each one of us, each scholar within their faith, they have responsibility to struggle and to make a contribution. I don't believe either me personally or Dr. Floyd or anybody else or yourself, independent of others, can make such a huge difference within the society. We have to work together, mindful that justice is for all, equality is for all. Peace must be a condition that everyone lives under, etc., etc. This is how I look at it.
I would echo the Sheikh's comments, and I would extend them further by saying, and these words are not mine, but the philosopher Cornel West, when he talks about the fact that justice is what love looks like in public. We understand and recognize the presence, the abundance of justice when people are willing to, for instance, in our current context, in our current situation, now that we're almost approaching a full year into the COVID-19 pandemic and all the lockdowns and shutdowns that are associated with it, we see in terms of Congress, and I'm particularly laser focused on the Senate, where less than a year ago, they could throw trillions of dollars out the door in order to subsidize and support the airline industry, hotels, cruise ships, these kind of big ticket corporate entities. But we're still now a full-blown year into the pandemic, and conversations about a living wage, in terms of a $15 minimum wage. The possibility, not even the strong likelihood, but the possibility of what they're calling stimulus checks, but I would dare argue they're more like stay alive checks, right? The idea that voting rights reforms or policing reforms that have been desperately needed and long overdue are sitting, accumulating dust on especially GOP politicians' desks, right? The notion of emphasis, the notion of what do you love, who do you love, how do you demonstrate your love, is incumbent by the speed at which, or the seriousness by which any of these endeavors are taking up, right? I borrow from the writer Jim Wallace, right, an activist who tells us that a budget, especially a federal, state, political budget, is a moral document, right? Right. The idea that, as in our tradition, my tradition, right, the notion that where your heart is, there you'll find your treasure, right? So people who, and let me just summarize this way, right? It is a shame and disgrace in a nation such as ours, where people are going through very personal, private pain on an hourly, not even daily or weekly basis. The idea that you have to start a GoFundMe page in order to get medical treatments, but yet every police department in the nation is fully funded, right? Schools have to have, spaghetti dinners or cookie sales. Meanwhile, the Defense Department has more money than it knows what to do with, right? I don't want to make this turn into the materialistic, but the idea that until we realize and recognize that we as a society have the ability to do what we want to do, but do you want to do it badly enough? And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Wow, that's a very profound thought to gel on for a second. The last question we will ask this evening comes from Marianne, and she asks, could you discuss a little bit more about the detail between, or the dynamism between faith and the Arab Spring, understanding that we're at the 10 years mark. The Arab Spring was mentioned by, I believe, one, if not both of you earlier. Could we speak a little bit to that?
I yield to the Sheikh.
Sorry, I just, the battery seemed to be running out, so I thought I'd charge it a little bit.
No worries.
The relationship between Arab Spring and the religion, I think one of the misconceptions was at the beginning, they wanted to relate Arab Spring primarily to faith, but I disagreed when certainly faith was a backdrop to the whole thing. As Muslim community, they naturally they consider about faith, but primarily the Arab Spring was a rise against an indirect colonialism that existed in their country, and primarily driven by socioeconomic factors. The fact that there was no equality, there was no freedom, there was no job, there was no future. At the same time, in the same way that Father Gautier would use Christian scripture as a motivating factor, those who wanted to give it some degree of rationality, they would appeal or invoke a few of the chapters of the Holy Quran or views of the Prophet or hadith here and there. But the primary motivation for the uprising was not the establishment of religion. It was there. They could go to the mosque and pray as much as they wanted. It was socioeconomic factors, absence of equality, absence of dignity, absence of justice, absence of job, absence of future. When the Tunisian guy burns himself, it's not because, say, the police officer is not Muslim and he is Muslim. No, it's because after graduating from university, there is no job, there is no justice, there is no respect. So I don't believe that there is a direct connection. Yes, indirect connection is there, but direct connection with the Arab Spring, I don't read it that way. I think it's primarily socioeconomic factors, plus colonial issues that led to the uprising in various countries.
I take and appreciate my colleagues' comments. Where I find my way into the conversation is especially the timing of what we dared to call the Arab Spring, in terms of the anticipation, the excitement around what was possible with the ascendancy of then President Obama, and also the kind of grand context of the global war on terror, right? Having already seen the better part of a decade, with the now relatively forgotten wars that the United States has been waging in Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless other parts of the globe, right? This hoped for optimism, both within the United States, that we would see a secession, an ending of those kind of global forces in terms of, U.S. military boots on the ground, but then also now the hoped for emergence of small d democracy in various parts of the globe, most particularly in the Middle East, right? But I think to the Sheikh's point, right, what happens when bitter realism, sours and crushes, these kind of green shoots, these burgeoning blossomings of freedom, justice, equality, and dignity, right? What we always have to wrestle with is that institutional power will always try to reify, and in some cases reinvent itself to guarantee its own self-preservation, right? So I believe, to the Sheikh's point, right, when you had an entire generation, especially of young men who were unemployed, unmarried, unconnected to the broader fabric of civil society, right? Their hunger, their anger, their passion, their needs have to be met some way. And I believe, much like we've seen recently here in the United States, right, for all the New York Times pieces about the Trump voter who, they were fueled by their economic anxiety. And yet, come January 6th of this year, right, they weren't preaching or proclaiming, economic indicators as their rationale for storming the Capitol, right? Also, just to make the point perfectly clear, right, among the throngs of folks who violated and desecrated our sacred temple of democracy, the U.S. Capitol, there was no member, as I understand it, there was no member of ISIS or Al-Qaeda. There was no member of Antifa or Black Lives Matters or Planned Parenthood or any of the other groups that are demonized by the far right and Fox News, right? These were people who said that they loved their country above all else. And yet, to quote the poet Amanda Gorman, right, they would rather shatter the nation than share it. So to that point, the idea that there are ways in which we demonstrate our faith that don't have to always automatically be spiritualized or sanctified, right? A faith in our fellow human being, a faith in democracy, small d democracy, a faith in the possibility, to the Sheikh's earlier comments, right? The possibility that humans can become better, can transform themselves, can, to borrow a Christian idiom, can redeem and save themselves, right? We still have to have that as somewhere in the condition of human possibility if we as people, institutions, and nations are going to survive in this world.
Before my battery runs out and I will not then be able to say anything, I want to conclude my point by directly talking to the younger generation, the students at the university, by reminding them that certainly publication of liberation theology has benefited a number of scholars and theologians. What the new and younger generations really need to do is to take the questions raised and directions outlined so far by various scholars and take it to the that we see that liberation theology continues and will not become simply something of passé, of the past of 1960s and 1970s. We will do whatever we can. It's your turn as well as a younger generation, educated and so on, to take what you have learned from the liberation theology and move forward and see how you can become the Messiah of your time, the Jesus of your time, the Muhammad of your time, the Moses of your time, whatever it is, and create unity and peace in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheikh Kazerouni, for bringing this to a close with inspiration and also motivation. And thank you as well to Dr. Floyd Thomas for doing the same. I want to just emphasize 2 points that I think are really important takeaways for us. One of them is your call for accountability, and that you ask everyone to, look at what they can do in their own space, but to hold not only others accountable, but to hold oneself accountable. And that, demand and, invocation for self-criticism as a means to then collective criticism and change, I think is something really important for us to think about. And I also want to thank you for making clear that you've mined liberation theology, you've deconstructed it in a way that shows that it resonates across faith communities, but also you've drawn the ideas out and the calls for action in a way that go beyond faith communities. So whether one is a person of faith or no faith, religion or no religion, you've made, the universals embedded in the concept of liberation theology accessible to all human beings, and certainly to all people who wish to be informed, active citizens. So thank you for that. And thank you for being with us. And
thank you for the invitation as well.
Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you all in person sometime at the Fletcher.
On Arab Spring, most likely.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Floyd. Thanks, Elizabeth.
And I
nice
turn it over now
to
Chris. You too. I turn it over to Chris now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we all leave, thank you for a very insightful and invigorating hour and a half. This is the second panel series in our larger semester-long series, Religion and Peacebuilding. I'd like to flag a couple more dates for your calendar. On March 11th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll have our third installment of the series, Women, Religion, and Peacebuilding. And then we will conclude on Thursday, April 1st, 5:30 to 7 p.m. EST with Religion and Community, Growing Resilience Through Interfaith Peacebuilding. So we hope to see you there. Thank you for coming, and have a good evening.